Michael had been dreaming about this moment for years. Ever since he started working at the police department, he'd put a little money aside every month, sometimes skipping luxuries so he could build a down payment fund, while other people went on expensive vacations or bought brand new cars. Michael kept his old pickup truck running and took weekend camping trips instead. He wasn't cheap, he just had a plan, and buying his own home was at the center of it. When he finally found the house, it felt like it had been waiting for him all along. It was in a quiet suburban neighborhood with wide streets, tidy lawns, and just enough trees to give shade in the summer. The house itself wasn't a mansion, but it had everything he wanted: 3 bedrooms, a big open living room, and a backyard perfect for barbecues. There was even a little porch where he could sit in the mornings with his coffee, the day he signed the papers. Michael drove straight to the house with a huge grin on his face. He stood in the empty living room, his footsteps echoing off the walls, and thought, "This is mine." That feeling alone made all the years of hard work worth it. Moving in was a blur of cardboard boxes, furniture deliveries, and late nights assembling shelves. Some of his colleagues stopped by to help, teasing him about how much stuff he had and how his taste in couches was way too fancy. For a guy who usually ate takeout at his desk, Michael didn't mind. These weren't just coworkers, they were like family. By the end of the week, he'd unpacked enough to feel like the place was coming together. That's when the idea hit him. A housewarming party would be the perfect way to celebrate his new chapter in life. Thank the friends who helped him move and bring everyone together for a relaxed evening. Plus, Michael loved cooking, and he finally had the space to host a real backyard barbecue. He grabbed his phone and started sending out messages. He invited the guys from his shift, a few from the detective unit, and even some from the K-9 team. He also reached out to family members who lived nearby and a couple of old school friends who'd been there for him through thick and thin. "Your appetites?" he texted with a smiley face. "I'm breaking in the grill." During the days leading up to the party, Michael noticed a few of his new neighbors. There was the older couple across the street who waved warmly when they saw him. There was a young mom who walked her toddler past his house every afternoon. Most people seemed polite, but they kept to themselves. Then there was Sharon. The first time he met her, she introduced herself as the president of the HOA. She was in her late 50s, with short, perfectly styled hair and a clipboard tucked under her arm like it was part of her uniform. She gave him a quick smile that didn't quite reach her eyes and said, "Welcome to the neighborhood. We have some very strict rules around here: quiet hours, yard maintenance, parking limits. I'll get you a copy." Michael nodded, trying to be friendly. "Sounds good. I'll make sure I follow the rules." She gave him a once-over, as if assessing whether he'd be trouble. "Good, we like to keep things orderly here." And she moved on, clipboard in hand. It wasn't the warmest introduction, but Michael wasn't about to judge her after one conversation. Maybe she was just proud of keeping the neighborhood nice. Still, there was a certain edge in her tone that stuck in his mind. The day before the party, Michael spent the afternoon prepping. He marinated racks of ribs, made a big bowl of potato salad, and stocked the fridge with drinks. The smell of smoked meat would be drifting through the air soon, and he was already imagining his friends' reactions. He also set up tables and chairs in the backyard, strung up some soft lights, and tested the small Bluetooth speaker he planned to use for background music. Nothing loud, just enough to make the evening feel lively. That evening, while Michael was adjusting the grill, Sharon passed by on her evening walk. She slowed down, eyeing the lights and chairs in his backyard. "Planning something?" she asked. "Yeah, just a small housewarming," Michael said, smiling. "A few friends, some food. Should be fun." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Well, just so you know, noise carries here, and we do have rules about gatherings." Michael kept his tone calm. "I understand. We'll keep it reasonable." She nodded, but didn't look convinced. "We've had incidents before." With that, she continued walking, muttering something he couldn't catch. Michael shook his head and went back to work. He wasn't worried his friends were respectful people. He wasn't about to let one tense neighbor ruin his excitement. The next morning, he woke up early, buzzing with anticipation. He ran to the store for last-minute supplies, cleaned the house from top to bottom, and made sure the backyard looked perfect. Around mid-afternoon, he got the first text. "On our way, Hope you're ready for hungry cops." Michael laughed to himself. Oh, he was ready. By the time the first car pulled up, the smell of barbecue had already filled the air. Michael greeted his friends with handshakes and hugs, ushering them toward the backyard. One by one, more guests arrived, uniforms nowhere in sight, but the unmistakable camaraderie of people who'd been through long nights and tough calls together. They brought cases of soda, homemade side dishes, and housewarming gifts wrapped in bright paper from his kitchen window. Michael noticed Sharon standing in her driveway, arms crossed, watching the guests walk in. She wasn't smiling. Told himself not to read too much into it. Some people just like to keep to themselves. He had no idea yet that by the end of the night, her crossed arms would turn into a phone call that would set the whole neighborhood buzzing. By early evening, the backyard was alive with the sounds of laughter, the sizzle of the grill, and the low hum of friendly conversation. Michael had set the music to a soft playlist, classic rock, a bit of country, and some old favorites that he knew everyone could enjoy without it feeling too loud. The warm smell of smoked ribs drifted across the yard, mixing with the scent of charcoal and freshly cut grass. Michael moved easily between groups, filling drinks, flipping meat on the grill, and joking with old friends from the department. Some were in plain t-shirts, others in jeans. But you could still spot the cop posture in the way they stood alert. It's confident, scanning their surroundings out of habit, even during a party. These were people Michael trusted with his life. And having them here made the new house feel even more like home. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, painting the neighborhood in a golden glow. A couple of kids' children of one of Michael's sergeants ran in circles, chasing each other with water guns, squealing with laughter. Their parents kept a casual eye on them while chatting about summer plans. Few guests had brought small folding chairs, setting them up near the fence so they could enjoy their food while talking. Michael was in the middle of explaining his new smoker setup to one of his buddies when he caught sight of movement out of the corner of his eye. Sharon was standing on the sidewalk near her driveway, staring toward the backyard. She wasn't smiling, and she didn't wave. She just stood there for a moment, her arms folded tightly, before walking slowly back toward her house. He decided to ignore it. She had already warned him once about noise, but honestly, it wasn't even close to loud. If anything, it sounded like a family picnic. A little while later, Michael's old academy friend, Jake, arrived carrying a giant foil-covered tray of chicken wings. "Figured your ribs could use some competition," he said with a grin. Laughed and led him to the grill. As the night went on, more people arrived, each one bringing more food than Michael knew what to do with. The table was soon covered in potato salad, chips, dips, homemade pies, and enough bread rolls to feed an army. Conversations overlapped, people clinked glasses. The music carried just enough to give the air a lively energy. But from across the street, Sharon was growing restless. She sat in her living room, peering out the blinds every few minutes. Each time, she saw more cars parked along the curb, more people filtering into Michael's backyard. She didn't recognize any of them, not that she expected to, but something about the group put her on edge. In her mind, she started imagining what was happening back there. Were they drinking heavily? Was the music going to get louder as the night wore on? Was this going to be one of those parties that left beer bottles rolling down the street by morning? She muttered under her breath about how the neighborhood used to be peaceful and how new people didn't always understand the rules. Then she picked up her phone, scrolling through her HOA contact list, debating whether to call another board member to complain. But the idea of making a direct complaint to Michael didn't sit right with her. She wanted official backup. Deciding she wasn't ready to act yet, she went outside under the pretense of watering her plants. The moment she stepped into her yard, she could hear the music more clearly, along with bursts of laughter. It wasn't outrageously loud, but to her, it felt like an invasion of the quiet she prized. She turned toward the fence, catching a partial glimpse of people holding plates and chatting. That's when she spotted one man holding a beer bottle and another with a glass of something amber-colored in his hand. Sharon's frown deepened. Meanwhile, in Michael's yard, the evening was still easygoing. At one point, he noticed Sharon's head briefly visible over the fence as she passed by, but she didn't say anything. Instead, she seemed to be counting. How many people were there? He shook his head and focused on tending to the food. Around an hour later, Sharon was back inside her house, pacing. She'd convinced herself that the gathering had already gone on too long, and that there must be rules about how many people could be hosted at once. The more she thought about it, the more certain she became that something wasn't right. Michael was oblivious to all of this. He was sitting at the picnic table with 3 of his closest friends, sharing stories from the job. They laughed about old calls, like the time a raccoon got stuck in the ceiling tiles of the station, and swapped tips about grilling techniques. Then, Sharon made her move. She picked up her phone and dialed a number she knew by heart, -911, in a crisp, controlled voice. She told the dispatcher there was a large, suspicious gathering happening at one of the houses in her neighborhood. She added that there was alcohol involved and possible public intoxication. The dispatcher, following protocol, took her statement seriously and sent the nearest available patrol units to check things out. Back in the backyard, no one had the slightest idea what was about to happen. Michael's grill was still sizzling. People were still chatting, and a group of kids had moved on from water guns to playing tag in the grass. The atmosphere was nothing but warm and welcoming. But somewhere nearby, 2 patrol cars were making their way down the quiet suburban streets. Lights ready, answering a call they didn't yet realize was about to turn into one of the funniest moments of their careers. The evening air was warm and soft, carrying the smell of grilled meat and the faint sound of music from Michael's backyard. Inside the fence, people laughed, plates were being filled, and the little string lights glowed in the early night. It was the perfect kind of gathering, comfortable, friendly, and without a hint of trouble. No one suspected that, just a few streets away. 2 patrol cars were slowly rolling toward the neighborhood, their radios buzzing with the details of a complaint. The dispatcher's voice had been calm but firm when she sent the units out. Caller reports a large gathering at 54 Willow Lane. Possible intoxication, noise complaint. Be advised. Unknown number of subjects. The officers acknowledged and started heading over, not thinking much of it. They got calls like this all the time. Sometimes it was just a bunch of teenagers with a speaker. Other times it was neighbors arguing about music. What neither of them realized was that 54 Willow Lane belonged to one of their own, the 2 patrol. Cars turned into Michael's Street, their headlights sweeping across the tidy driveways and neat lawns. From the backyard, a couple of Michael's friends noticed the movement first. Through the gaps in the fence, they caught sight of flashing red and blue lights reflecting off a nearby house. "Oh, Mike," one of them said with a smirk. "You expecting company from the department tonight?" Michael looked up from the grill, confused. "What do you mean?" Another friend pointed toward the front of the house. "I think you've got units pulling up." Michael walked to the side gate just in time to see 2 uniformed officers getting out of their cars. He recognized both of them instantly: Patrol Officer Daniels, who had a dry sense of humor, and Officer Lopez, who had worked a few late shifts with him the year before. Daniels spotted him right away. "Oh, you've got to be kidding me," he called out, already starting to laugh. Michael grinned, shaking his head. "What's going on?" Lopez held up his hands in a mock serious way. "We got a call about a suspicious gathering. Large crowd. Possible drinking, noise disturbance." Behind Michael, some of the guests started wandering toward the gate, curious. When they saw who had arrived, the laughter started almost immediately. Someone shouted, "Busted, Mike. Party's over." In a joking tone, which only made the officers grin more, Daniels looked past Michael into the yard and let out a low whistle. Wow. The caller forgot to mention that the suspicious gathering was basically half the police department off duty. Stepped inside the gate, scanning the tables piled high with food, the kids running around, and the perfectly reasonable volume of the music. "This is the quietest noise complaint I've ever responded to," he said, shaking his head. Michael crossed his arms, smiling. "Let me guess who called." Daniels glanced toward a house down the street where, behind the curtains, a figure was barely visible peeking out. "Neighbor?" he asked knowingly. Neighbor Michael confirmed. At that moment, a few of Michael's colleagues decided to play along. One of them dramatically pulled out his wallet and pretended to hand over his driver's license. Another held up his soda like it was evidence. "Officer, I swear, this is just root beer," he said with mock panic. Lopez chuckled. "We'll have to run that through the lab." The atmosphere was pure comedy now, with the responding officers shaking, their heads in disbelief. They had come expecting to remind some strangers to keep it down. Instead, they'd walked into what looked like an unofficial department reunion with barbecue ribs. Still, they had a job to do, so Daniels asked in a more formal tone, "All right. Anything going on here that I need to put in my report?" Michael played along. "Well, someone might have taken the last slice of pie without asking, but we handled it internally." The joke got a fresh wave of laughter from the crowd. While this was happening, Sharon had stepped outside her own house, phone still in hand, waiting for the officers to shut things down. From her driveway, she watched the scene unfolding only. Something was off. Instead of stern voices and people leaving, she saw smiles, handshakes, and even hugs. The officers didn't seem to be stopping the party at all. She frowned and took a few steps closer. From the gate, Daniels noticed her and called out, "Ma'am, are you the one who called this in?" Sharon hesitated, but her pride pushed her forward. "Yes. I live across the street. I heard loud music, saw a lot of cars, didn't recognize these people, and it seemed suspicious." Lopez nodded politely, but with a trace of amusement in his eyes. "Ma'am, these people are off duty." "Officers. It's a private gathering. Everything here is under control." Sharon blinked, clearly not expecting that answer. "Off-duty officers." Michael stepped forward, keeping his tone friendly but firm. "Yes, ma'am. They're my friends from the department. I'm a police officer myself. This is my housewarming party." For a moment, Sharon looked like she didn't know what to say. Her eyes darted around the yard, taking in the familiar blue and black jackets draped over chairs, the easy way the responding officers were talking with the guests, and the complete lack of chaos. The realization hit her hard. She had called 911 on the police department. Michael could see the color rising in her cheeks. She opened her mouth, closed it again, and muttered something about just being concerned for the neighborhood. Daniels, still smiling, said gently, "We appreciate neighbors looking out for the community, ma'am, but there's no problem here tonight." Sharon gave a tight nod, clearly wishing she could disappear, and started back toward her house. A few of Michael's friends exchanged amused glances, and someone whispered, "That's going to be one awkward HOA meeting." The responding officers stayed for a few more minutes, partly to make sure the situation was documented, but mostly because the smell of ribs was too tempting to ignore. Michael fixed them each a plate for their trouble, and Daniels joked, "This might be the best call I've ever been dispatched to." Eventually, they headed back to their cars, leaving behind a yard full of people who now had a brand new story to tell for years to come. And Michael, as he went back to the grill, couldn't help but chuckle. He had a feeling Sharon wasn't going to call 911 on him again anytime soon, at least not without thinking very, very carefully first. Sharon stood frozen for a moment in her driveway, her phone still in her hand, feeling heat rush up her neck and into her face. She could hear bits of conversation and laughter from Michael's backyard, and every single sound made her more aware of what she had just done. She had called the police to report what she thought was a suspicious gathering. And now she knew the truth. It was a yard full of off-duty cops, half of whom were still wearing their department baseball caps or jackets. She turned toward her house quickly, hoping to retreat inside before anyone else noticed her. But the thing was, everyone had noticed her. A few of Michael's friends glanced toward the street as she walked away, and while no one shouted anything, she could feel their eyes on her back. That kind of silence, polite but pointed, was almost worse than outright teasing in the backyard. The responding officers were still chatting with Michael, clearly in no hurry to leave. One of them, Daniels, leaned casually against the fence. As he chewed on a rib, talking with two detectives who'd been swapping old case stories, the other, Lopez, had accepted a cold soda and was now laughing about the idea of writing up a housewarming party for excessive friendliness. Sharon could still hear their voices, even from inside her living room. It wasn't that they were loud, it was that she was listening for them now, her curiosity battling with her embarrassment. She peeked through the blinds again, The officers were smiling, people were shaking hands, and even the kids were offering them plates of chips. It was the exact opposite of what she had pictured. When she made the call, she imagined the police, arriving with serious expressions, asking for IDs, maybe even telling people to leave. She'd pictured herself as the concerned citizen who had helped keep order in the neighborhood. Now, instead of looking like the responsible HOA president, she felt like she had just played the lead role in a neighborhood comedy one where she was the punchline. Michael, for his part, wasn't about to be rude about it, but he also wasn't going to pretend the whole thing hadn't happened. Once the responding officers had gotten their plates of food, he strolled toward the gate where Sharon had been standing earlier. He caught her eye for just a second before she turned away from the window. He raised his voice enough to be heard over the fence, but kept his tone light. If there's ever an issue, you can always just knock, Sharon. Saves a call to dispatch. There was no reply from the house, but a few of his friends chuckled. Someone muttered, "That's one way to send an RSVP." The laughter spread, and soon people were joking about calling in backup if they ran out of barbecue sauce or reporting a disturbance. If someone tried to sneak the last piece of cornbread, Michael went along with it, smiling and shaking his head, but part of him wanted Sharon to hear all of it just so she'd think twice before pulling the same stunt again. Meanwhile, Sharon paced around her kitchen, trying to convince herself. "It wasn't that bad. I was just looking out for the neighborhood," she muttered. "I didn't know they were police officers. Anyone could have been back there." But the truth was, she knew deep down that she hadn't really heard anything bad. She'd acted on suspicion, and if she was honest with herself, a little irritation. Outside, the party carried on as if nothing had happened, except now it had an extra layer of humor to it. Daniels and Lopez eventually left, waving goodbye, like they'd just visited friends, not responded to a call. Their departure didn't feel like a shutdown at all. In fact, the only difference was that now everyone had a funny story to tell. A couple of Michael's colleagues took turns glancing at Sharon's house whenever the crowd burst into laughter. Just to see if the blinds twitched, they did every single time. It became a little game for them. Tell a joke, watch the blinds. The real turning point came when one of the older officers, retired now but still sharp as ever, leaned over to Michael and said quietly, "You know, she's going to think twice before crossing you again. People don't like making public mistakes, especially not in front of half the precinct." Michael nodded. He didn't want to humiliate her, but he also wasn't going to tiptoe around her in his own neighborhood. She wanted to make assumptions. She could live with the consequences later in the evening. When the crowd had thinned a little, Michael took a moment to step out front and get some air. He could see Sharon's house across the street, a single light glowing in the living room. The blinds were still tilted just enough for someone to peek through. He thought about walking over to smooth things over, but then he decided against. It wasn't his job to fix her embarrassment. Time and maybe a few more friendly encounters would do that, back inside. The conversation turned to other things, but the story of the neighbor who called 911 on a house full of cops was already cementing itself as a favorite. People added dramatic embellishments, claiming Sharon had been patrolling with binoculars or writing down license plates like she was on a stakeout. Each retelling got a little more ridiculous, and each time, the laughter grew. By the time the last guests left, Michael was tired but happy. The party had been a success, and the unexpected visit from Daniels and Lopez had turned into the kind of shared memory that made people feel closer. Across the street, Sharon's house was dark now, but Michael had a feeling this wouldn't be. The last time they interacted, the difference was, from now on, he knew exactly how to handle her, and somewhere in the back of his mind, he couldn't help thinking how ironic it was, in a job where he'd responded to every kind of call imaginable. The funniest one of all had happened in his own backyard. The morning after the party, the neighborhood was unusually quiet. The air smelled faintly of last night's barbecue, and the string lights in Michael's backyard still hung over the fence, swaying gently in the breeze. Michael stood in his kitchen with a mug of coffee, looking out the window at the street. Everything looked calm, normal, almost like the events of the night before had been a dream. But it hadn't been a dream, and Michael knew it. He smiled to himself as he remembered. The looks on Daniel's and Lopez's faces when they realized they'd been sent to investigate a house full of their own colleagues. He could still hear the laughter, the jokes, and even Sharon's awkward silence when she realized she had called 911 on a bunch of police officers. He also knew one thing for sure: word was going to spread. By late morning, he had proof of that. His phone buzzed with a text from his friend Jake. "Already hearing about your party at the station. Someone's calling it Operation Barbecue." Another message came in a few minutes later from a detective he hadn't even invited. "So, how does it feel to be the first cop to have a noise complaint filed by the HOA during your own housewarming?" Michael chuckled. Cops were quick when it came to gossip, especially funny gossip, and this was the kind of story that could circle the station in under a day. Meanwhile, across the street, Sharon's blinds stayed closed. Her house had the same drawn look it did when she wanted to avoid people. And Michael didn't see her step outside once all morning. He figured she was probably replaying the night in her head, just like he was, only for her. It probably felt a lot less funny. That afternoon, Michael decided to take down the party setup. He stacked the folding chairs, rolled up the extension cords for the lights, and scrubbed the grill. As he was finishing, one of his neighbors from down the street walked over. It was the older man who lived in the brick house with the rose bushes. "Morning," the man said with a smile. "Heard you had quite the crowd last night?" Michael raised an eyebrow, wondering how much he knew. "We had a good time." "Nothing too crazy?" The man chuckled knowingly. "My wife and I heard the sirens when the patrol cars came down the street. We thought, oh, trouble already. Then we saw the officers laughing and eating ribs. Figured it wasn't much of an emergency." Michael grinned. "Yeah, turns out it was the friendliest police call in history." The neighbor leaned. "In a little between you and me, that woman across the street? She's been looking for something to complain about since before you moved in. She's called the HOA on people for leaving their trash bins out too long, for parking too close to the curb, you name it. This one's going to be hard for her to top." That piece of information made Michael feel a little better. It wasn't personal, it was just how Sharon operated. But he also knew that this particular incident had probably rattled her more than any other complaint she'd made. Sure enough, over the next few days, he started noticing subtle changes. If Sharon happened to be outside when he was coming or going, she would quickly look away or pretend to be busy with something else. Once he even caught her mid-step toward his driveway before she turned around and walked back into her house. He didn't mind the avoidance. In fact, it made things easier. The neighborhood itself seemed more relaxed around him now, as if the party and the way it played out had quietly earned him a bit of local credibility. A week later, the HOA sent out its monthly email newsletter. Buried halfway down, in between reminders about lawn care and recycling schedules, was a short note: "We encourage all residents to communicate directly with their neighbors about concerns before escalating to official channels. A friendly conversation can go a long way toward maintaining harmony." Michael nearly spit out his coffee when he read it. It was polite, but to anyone who knew what had happened, it was obvious who that message was aimed at. That weekend, he was back at the station for his shift, and the story had taken on a life of its own. One officer pretended to radio in to dispatch, saying, "Be advised. Possible disturbance at Willow Lane, subject is grilling too many ribs without a permit." Another started calling him BBQ 911. Every time he walked into the break room, someone found a way to bring it up. Michael didn't mind. If anything, the humor of it made the shift go faster. And it was the kind of joke that built camaraderie. Everyone could laugh without anyone really being the butt of the joke. Well, except maybe Sharon, but she wasn't there to hear it. Back in the neighborhood, Michael decided he wasn't going to stop hosting gatherings just because of one phone call. Over the next month, he had a couple of friends over to watch sports, grilled burgers for his brother's birthday, and even held a small poker night. Nothing big, nothing wild, and most importantly, nothing that would give Sharon another excuse to call in a complaint. If she noticed these smaller gatherings, she didn't act on them. By the end of summer, Michael had become more than just the new guy on the street. He'd helped one neighbor carry in a heavy new dining table, given another a jump start when her car battery died, and even offered to keep an eye on a house while the owners went on vacation. Little by little, people waved more when they saw him stop to chat when he was in the yard, and brought over baked goods just because. And yes, every now and then, someone would mention that night. It became a sort of neighborhood legend. The story was always told with a smile, sometimes exaggerated for dramatic effect. She called 911. When the cops showed up, they were already at the party. People laughed every time, and Michael could tell it had made him a little more memorable around here. As for Sharon, she seemed to settle into a quieter routine. She still did her HOA duties, passing out flyers, attending meetings, but she kept her interactions with Michael limited to the occasional polite nod. If she was still embarrassed, she hid it well. Michael never rubbed it in, never brought up the call in front of her, and never acted smug about it. He figured the situation had already spoken for itself, and there was no need to stir things up again. One night, months later, as Michael sat on his porch with a cup of coffee, he saw Sharon walking her small dog. She gave him a quick wave, small, almost shamed for the first time since the incident. She actually stopped for a moment. "Your party," she said after a pause. "It wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be." Michael smiled. "I try to keep things reasonable." She nodded, tugged gently at her dog's leash, and said, "Well, I suppose I overreacted." Then she walked on. It wasn't much, but Michael took it as her version of an apology. And honestly, that was enough for him. He leaned back in his chair, watching the dog trot down the street, and thought about how one awkward night had turned into a story he'd probably be telling for years. Not just because it was funny, but because it reminded him of something important. Sometimes the best way to handle tension is with patience, a bit of humor, and maybe a plate of ribs for the right people. And as the porch light glowed warmly over his new home, Michael knew one thing for sure. This street might have its quirks, but it was his street now.